So it's 7 o'clock on March 5th, 2019. This is a meeting of the Norfolk Board of Health. We have no public hearings for this evening, but we do have a couple of discussions in front of us. The first of them being a continuation of a discussion on restricting the sale of tobacco products. Now, anybody here interested in that one? Okay. Because I know there's another one coming at 7:30 that maybe a larger group is going to be interested in. For right now.
Interested in tobacco or the e-cigarettes?
This is the e-cigarettes we're talking about now.
All right, 7:30 is the next agenda, okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So we're expecting a full audience at that point.
Ooh, exciting.
Yeah.
Aren't you glad you came to this meeting?
So, let us begin, because we are in fact looking at some amendments to our existing regulations dealing with the sale of tobacco products. And we'd like to gather as much input as we can before we publish these for public consumption. So, would you care to introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Jennifer Wynn, and I'm a resident, a parent, and a member of the school committee in town. And I have a letter that I'd like to give you, but I'd like to read it first, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Dear Norfolk Board of Health, I'm writing to express my opinion and support of the development of a gold standard health regulation regarding e-cigarettes and related flavored products. A month ago, I became interested in having Norfolk develop a health regulation regarding e-cigarettes and the related products due to both personal and professional reasons. I have watched the last two Board of Health meetings to become more educated on the topic and have met with the Norfolk School Community Officer Michelle Palladini, who supports regulating these products in town. As a parent, as a middle school teacher, and a member of the Norfolk School Committee, I have a strong vested interest in regulating these products in Norfolk. A month ago, I was shopping in Shaw's grocery store when my children and I witnessed and smelled a young woman vaping. She was taking multiple hits in her sleeve. I was shocked and horrified, in my opinion, at the level of obvious addiction this young person had. I heard stories from students at KP High School complaining about the smell of vaping in the bathrooms. In addition, I had heard stories from my work colleagues suspecting and smelling vaping in the bathrooms by middle school students. I had heard from middle school students about students posting themselves vaping on Instagram. But it never hit home until I saw the raw result of this dangerous, highly addictive product in public, a grocery store. And if you think your child is too nice or naive to be immune from this, I can tell you they are not. Many nice, smart kids are being caught vaping in school bathrooms. Other students are being exposed to secondhand smoke hand fumes, in which we have yet to research the ramifications of secondhand vape smoke. My children asked what she was doing, and I had to begin to have the unfortunate discussion of addiction at their young ages, 6 and 8. This prompted me to look up the laws regarding vaping and was pleased to read Massachusetts passed a law prohibiting the sale of tobacco and e-cig products to those under 21, as well as prohibiting vaping in schools and workplaces. However, to me, this was clearly not enough. And knowing the other surrounding towns that have passed much stricter regulations, this prompted me to do more investigation. Personally, I grew up in the times of Joe Camel and all the other marketing strategies Big Tobacco used to get the kids smoking. And as I learn more, I see what is happening with the colorful packages and fun names, cotton candy, mango, whatever. They are doing it again. Altria, a Philip Morris company, just invested a 35% stake in Juul in 2018. And I say this with utter conviction. These products are targeting children by glorifying their packaging and placing them at eye level in convenience stores. Top shelf branding, which we all know people pay premium for because there has been market research that is the best way to get someone to buy something when it is top shelf. As part of the deal, Altria agreed to give Juul top shelf space, so Juul pods are displayed alongside Altria's Marlboro cigarettes, and I just reference here that it was what article is from CNBC. They are targeting adolescents and young adults who neurologically do not have the frontal lobe development to make well thought out decisions. This is a biological fact. Thus why adolescents are known to be impulsive and have more accidents than those over age 21. After listening to Dr. Hartman, Officer Palladini, and other professional presentations, and my own middle school students, I respectfully and urgently ask the Board of Health to consider the following health regulations for our town. And I know I have strong parent support for this, which I believe you've received some emails today about it. Ban vaping in public places such as coffee shops, retail food establishments, bars, restaurants, any area open to the general public. Restrict flavored tobacco with the exception of mint and menthol, which from my understanding, right now, the FDA still approves it, so it would be very hard to ban those two particular flavored tobaccos or nicotines. Restrict the selling of e-cigarettes and their products to adult-only retail stores. I'm sure the majority of the residents, parents, and children in Norfolk insist upon and support a healthy climate and culture in town. Do not forgo instituting a gold standard health regulation for the sake of money some retailers may lose and inconvenience a very small percentage, what I believe to be a very small percentage of adults. Anybody in here, Jewel? No. So, and I can tell you I'm on numerous parent organizations. Socially, I've never seen anyone vape. It is the adolescents who are vaping. That is who's going to be inconvenienced, in my opinion, the majority. May have to drive out of town to purchase these dangerous and highly addictive products. Let's send a strong message, stronger than the tobacco and flavored nicotine industries, and show our children that Norfolk does not accept these products as part of our everyday lives. Vaping is a documented epidemic, and the people of Norfolk will not sell out our children health for retail and convenience of a small majority. To base a health regulation decision upon a possible loss of retail revenue or convenience would be, in my opinion, unethical and a monumental disservice to the children of Norfolk. Thank you for this consideration of this matter, and I have no doubt the Board of Health will make the right choice regarding our children and their health.
Thank you. Are there any other,
Can I ask a clarifying question?
Sure.
An adult-only store is, what's an example of that, an adult-only store?
well, we're talking about, there
Not
are
a liquor
places,
store.
smoke shops basically, smoke shops that are available to anybody over 21.
Okay.
The question then always comes up, where do you find a smoke shop in Norfolk? And the answer is you don't find one. We don't have any. But what this would do would be to essentially limit the sale of, well, we have to make up our minds. But certainly the idea of any flavored tobacco or tobacco products or nicotine-linked products would be limited to establishments like that. The one question that I think we need to discuss.
Tom, can I just
Sure.
clarify? In the regulations that we're considering, other revision to our current regulations, there is a definition of an adult-only retail tobacco store. So it's an establishment, I mean, it's pretty much what Tom said, but we do have a definition, and entry of a person under the minimum age is prohibited. So that's a little bit different than being able to go into, anybody can go into a convenient mart.
Right.
Or a
What
liquor
about like
store.
a liquor store?
I
Does
can
anybody
bring my
go into
child.
the
No,
Yeah,
it's,
bring-
okay,
if
so
I wanted
maybe
to.
I should read the definition. So it's an establishment that is not required to possess a retail food permit whose primary purpose is to sell or offer for sale, but not for resale, tobacco products and tobacco paraphernalia in which the sale of other products or offer of services is merely incidental, so it could not be a liquor store, and in which the entry of persons under the minimum legal age, sale age, is prohibited at all times, and which maintains a valid permit for the retail sale of tobacco products as required by the Norfolk Board of
Like that
Health.
place in Norwood, there's just a smoke shop.
I don't know.
So yeah,
Franklin has a
I'll
vape
say
store.
Jackie Katz, I'm on North Street. I'm a teacher at Wellesley High. So I have experience with high school kids who are vaping all the time, and so I think, I agree with this regulation, and I just hope that we don't stop there, because the reason I don't smoke has nothing to do with its availability to me. It has to do with the fact that I'm convinced it hurts my health. And I think that we're kidding ourselves if we think reducing access will be enough to stop our kids from hurting themselves. And so my biggest concern comes with, how are we gonna improve our health programs so that kids are as scared to vape as I was to smoke? So I think I think this is a great first step, and there's so much more that has to actually be done, because kids are gonna get what they want, based on the kids I'm seeing.
But I think it's setting a climate and culture in this town when it's advertised, right, when it's marketed. Adolescents go into convenience stores all the time, and there it is, bam, you go up, you pay for your Slurpee, there it is. Look at the coat, look, it's cotton candy, it's mango. I mean, it's marketed. I grew up in the, like I said, the time of all the marketing of the tobacco, until finally we got wise enough. And I could tell you that the overwhelmingly response to this town banning the sale, not only the sale of marijuana, but the restriction of even having a shop in town, I can guarantee you, this is the majority of the way that the town feels. We want a message. This is highly addictive. We don't want it. Don't sell it. If somebody wants, it's a free market. If somebody wants to come in and open an adult vape shop, there's no restriction to that. We're not saying that. If I want a gun, can I buy a gun in town? No, I cannot. I have to go to Bass Pro. If I want a certain product, can I have to go on the internet? Sure, because it's not no one's saying that you can't have access if you're over 21. What we're saying is, don't push it in the kid's face, which is what they're doing. So that's my impassioned speech.
And I agree with you, Jackie. You know, when you have a problem, this is an epidemic, you do have to come at that problem from many directions. I know that the King Philip High School is forming a coalition for healthy communities and looking to get a federal grant. And one of their things that they would be doing is education for this problem that we have right now. Right now, kids at the high school, if they get caught vaping, they're suspended. I'm sorry, that's not true. The first offense, they have to do a detention on a Saturday. The second offense, they're suspended for a day or so. But nothing to educate them. So this is why this, you know, going forward, the high schoolers realize that, and they realize that they have to educate kids. And we did. We educated them about smoking. And now we have this other product that is addictive, if not
And like Jen said, it looks more fun, because it's like bubblegum.
So.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're part of a larger picture here, and clearly there has to be education to go along with any regulation. I mean, I remember, I'm old enough to remember way back to a time when almost everybody smoked, and it was the cool thing to do. And then all of a sudden, a awareness that, hey, look, these folks are dying. Important people are no longer with us. And, you know, education really at the elementary level was a huge part in turning that tide around. And I'm hoping that that is an occupation that, is occupying the minds of teachers in the elementary school and in the middle school, especially, and of course in the high school. I mean, I don't know what the programs are. We've had the liaison officer here, but I know it took a lot of work way back when to kind of pull people away from smoking. And clearly, there's an awful lot of misinformation out there right now about the so-called, you know, no problem kind of attitude that people have about vaping. And the only way to negate that is with a lot of information that suggests, no, the stuff that's inside here is different than the stuff in cigarette smoke. Doesn't mean it's good for you.
Right.
And the addictive results are still there. So I think what we really need to do as a community is attack this both from the sort of the visual impact, which is what we're talking about actually at the board here, but also in terms of just convincing kids that this is pretty serious. And in the sort of lollipop, you know, framework that's been created around this is something that we need to break down. The kind of good news is people like the FDA are really working hard on this particular topic, which is a little surprising actually given what's going on in Washington. But they have really made it a priority, and I'm hoping that they and Massachusetts and the towns can together create a climate that says, hey, look, this is not good. You're really taking a serious risk. And you talk about somebody apparently unable not to be smoking wherever they were in that grocery store. We need to be able to make it clear that this is a serious, addictive product, and you don't want to start because you're going to have a very difficult time stopping. Would you like to say something?
I'm nodding my head a lot.
I hear you nodding.
Yeah, I'm Christy Poggi. I have a 9th grader and a 6th grader and a 3rd grader. So my daughter's at KP high school, and then I have one almost at the middle school. I know that Officer Plimpton does a great job with the DARE program, and I think over the last few years has been adding to his curriculum some information about vaping and e-cigarettes. Because my daughter, who's in 9th grade, didn't really have that piece in the DARE program. There was it hadn't filtered into it yet. But now my daughter, who's in 6th grade and has had DARE with OP the last few years, has learned about vaping. So she understands it to a greater degree. She understands the risks to a greater degree. She kind of believes that it's more than water vapor. Like a lot of the kids who are in high school right now are the ones walking around saying, well, this isn't bad for me. It's just water vapor. It's totally fine. It's totally safe. So I think there was this gap as it was exploding at the high school and even at the middle school. They were starting to realize, okay, we have to get this into the DARE program. So that's some good news. But I definitely think some of the kids that are high school age, as you were saying, there's a lot of misconception, and I agree with you also that they're going to get it. They get it from older kids, older friends, older siblings, and even in some cases adults. But I think that Jen's letter is spot on, and that there's a lot of parental support around just trying to send the right message and restrict the access to it and the just being bombarded by it visually. We know our kids go in and out of Walgreens.
What else
a
is there
ton.
to do in town?
Right, they walk in there, they buy gum, they buy
Slurpees.
anything that looks exciting, and it's upsetting that it's right there in their face.
Well, fortunately, because of the new law in Massachusetts, Walgreens no longer sells tobacco products. So you won't see that display in Walgreens anymore.
Including vaping, the vaping products?
A vaping product, if it has nicotine in it,
Yeah,
it's a tobacco product,
okay.
okay? Because that's where nicotine comes from.
Yeah.
So they're not selling any of those vaping products in Walgreens. Where they're going to
When
be
did
able
they
to
stop?
get them. I'm sorry?
When did they stop?
December 31st.
Oh, okay, I was gonna say, because I
No,
feel
it
like I
just
just saw it there.
happened.
All
Yeah,
right, so this
just
is new,
happened,
okay.
all right? So take a walk in and you'll see, maybe they've put something in the display. The last time I was there, that whole wall at the cash register was completely empty, which
Oh,
was
okay.
a good thing.
That is-
But, the convenience store across the street, the convenience store near the train station,
Yeah.
the Richfield, is that
The
it?
new one, yeah,
And the Gulf station.
yeah.
Surveys show that 74% of the kids that responded to the survey say they get these products from retail stores.
Yeah.
So I think that's why you have to come at a problem from a lot of different directions.
And if they can't get it, it sends the message, there's a reason you're not allowed to get it. And something's wrong with it, right? Like, that's why you're not allowed to have it.
Mhm.
It's just not blatantly there.
Although you have to maybe superimpose upon that the education that we're talking about, because sometimes they'll just say, well, they're just not being fair about it, or some, you have to also explain, hey, look, there's a really, really good reason why we don't think you should be ingesting this material.
And even then, as Jen was saying, they don't have the same, their brains aren't developed yet, so
They're
they don't understand
impulsive.
consequences, they don't get something's gonna matter in 6
Right.
years, you know?
Yeah, it's not gonna hurt me.
It's never gonna
So
be
you need
that.
a creative, compelling argument that works for a 12-year-old. Yeah, not quite sure what
I've
that
started
is.
scaring my 8-year-old, so she's like, "Where are you going tonight?" I told her. She's like, "I'll never vape." I'm like, "Nope."
Any other comments? I know you all in the back here are on a different project or different topic, but if you have anything you'd like to share about this conversation on vaping, feel free to do
Well,
so.
it's interesting, I'll add something, Scott Gottlieb is gonna
Yeah.
resign in a month, he's the commissioner at the FDA, and he apparently has been the guy that's been pushing, in particular against Jim, who's had a lot of concerns as regards to how they sell their product.
Mhm.
And they have issues with Walgreen and other states. Not here because we took care of the issue already, but that's, that is the FDA component. I hope, we all hope that, that continues, that somehow that's institutionalized within the FDA.
Mhm.
So along those lines, just to be more specific, his policy that, I don't know where it's gonna go from here, now that he's resigned, would take the sale of flavored tobacco product, all flavored tobacco, whether it's non-combustible or non-combustible, out of retail stores. So the FDA was going to push for that, or is pushing for that with the policy, as well as taking mint and menthol flavor out of regular combustible tobacco. So it's all flavors was going to come out. So hopefully that policy will go through, but who knows, now that he's leaving.
We should mention that the focus of the proposal before our board is to treat all flavored tobacco products or other products with nicotine in them equally in terms of simply not allowing them to be sold in an establishment that's frequented by young people. You have to be over 21 to be able to even go in the front door. Now, right now anyway, those establishments, while they're described in our regulations, haven't in fact sprung up yet. It'll be interesting to see how many there are. I mean, we don't have a large population here, so it may well be that we're not going to have such a shop in Norfolk for a while.
We can't get a red box. I highly doubt. Like, I'm sorry, you can't even rent out the buildings next to Norfolk Food Mart. Like, good luck. Like, but that's okay. They have every right to try. Sorry, I'm being facetious.
So it would also, our regulations would also impact flavored cigars and cigarillos, I guess. If we said we were going to restrict the sale of flavored tobacco products. So we have a couple of options in these regulations. One was also to completely ban the sale of e-cigarettes, whether they were flavored or non-flavored, because there are some e-cigarettes that just have tobacco in them, and then there are some e-cigarettes that have, they say they have no nicotine in them. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say tobacco, I meant to say nicotine, but it's a tobacco product. Some flavored, some e-cigarettes that say they don't contain any nicotine, but studies have shown that they contain a very small amount of nicotine. So that's why we have the option of saying we're going to ban all e-cigarettes, or we're just going to ban flavored tobacco products, which would include e-cigarettes that have flavors, but not those that don't have flavors. I mean, we have a couple of options in these regs, which we haven't really discussed as a board.
In fact, this conversation is useful, because I believe you indicated what you would like to see in the gold standard version of our
Yes.
regulations is essentially no availability of any kind of e-cigarette device or refill anywhere where a young person under the age of 21 could frequent. And in fact, that is on our table as something to consider. The other side of it would be to say, well, the flavored products are really the ones, just like the Joe Camel thing again, that really are focusing on young people. And so if we are really intending to have an impact on the young folks, then certainly we do not want those products to be visible, to be there in front of them, to be enticing them to make bad decisions. Even though theoretically they still can't buy them because they're not 21.
Somehow they get it.
Well, unless you can 100% guarantee it, that's one or two children too many that are getting access to it. You can't guarantee that 100% of the time that every convenience store is carding kids. We're nodding, we've all been young and bought beer underage, like, it happens.
Right, the simplest way to guarantee compliance is not to make it available in the first place. I got the argument.
So where can we go from here? Because we really have to digest these.
Well, right, I mean, we have, well, first of all, we gotta get our third member of the board in
Right.
the conversation. So, well, this was really an attempt to, first of all, listen to folks and hear what you had to say. And I think you know that we are on the track to do something which we believe will have an impact. And the question is it going to be one that is the complete gold standard, or does it have a little bit of a silver lining? I don't know. We'll have to think about that.
Well, I would just put my 2 cents in and say that knowing the climate and culture again of the town, I would say, being a democracy, what would the majority want? And I believe the majority would want the gold standard, period.
Mhm.
And the small, I'm going off on a limb, 5% that may want that e-cig, plain flavored, does not outweigh what the majority would want. And if we bring it to town vote, we bring it to town vote.
Mhm.
Like we did with the marijuana. But we're hoping that the Board of Health will take a stand and support what we know to be let's get ahead of it before, if we had known then what tobacco was, maybe we would have gotten ahead of it and we wouldn't see it sold still on shelves.
Mhm.
And that's where, but you guys have to do what you have to do.
I think too, the perception of e-cigarettes by kids is different than an actual cigarette. Like even I think that they do see that difference there, so I think the people who are using e-cigarettes tend to be younger and so I think if we're going on the side of protecting kids, I think that the e-cigarettes do tend to gear toward a younger generation.
Mhm.
And I mean, if you're 18 and you're buying them legally, you're also probably not staying in our town limits every day and you're going other places where you're gonna be able to buy. It's really just within our very small town.
Yeah, well, research shows that like only 1.5% of adults are using these products.
The e-cigarettes, yeah.
So, and there are lots, every day, there's another product on the market.
So I think
Besides the jury.
if we, as a town and Board of Health, have the ability right now to set a standard that we do not, nicotine is bad, it's a bad health choice, then we're able to do it now, whereas it's too late for cigarettes. Let's set the tone now. It's just not acceptable. And like I said, the small majority that may be upset definitely does not outweigh, I know, what other people feel.
Do you have numbers on percentage of high school kids, age kids that are using
Locally or
e-cigarettes?
In Massachusetts?
Nationally or locally, anywhere?
Well, in Massachusetts, about 30%.
Wow.
I would guess that that's low. I would guess that.
We can't catch them. I work in a middle school. You smell it, like you walk in and unless you catch them right, you can't search a kid. You're like, they hide it really well. They hide it really well.
And some of the numbers that you hear about, just more nationally, some school districts are finding that like upwards of 80% of their students are vaping. And this includes athletes, kids who are out running on the, basketball players. They're doing it because they don't realize it's bad, they don't
It's a
realize it's gonna
high.
hurt them, and then they get addicted.
One pod in one of those vaping pens is a pack of cigarettes. Like it's a high. Imagine smoking a pack of cigarettes all at once. The
Oh, I
nicotine
think it'd kill you, so I'd,
Yeah.
Oh, you pack of cigarettes at once?
Well, the
Like
nicotine
all that
content
content
in like
of
a,
the
in a, yeah, I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah, that's, well, the
So-
numbers are just amazing.
It's really, really huge.
Does anybody
problem.
here Jewel? Does anybody care if we like got rid of E6?
See, nobody really, the tiny percentage, so we can may have the ability, ban it. And if anybody complains, send them to me, okay? I will take it
Talk
on.
to Jen.
Talk to Jen.
Getting back to the numbers.
I will drive to Walpole in Franklin.
And the way back.
I got Margaret Haley. I had one thing about it that I know, the talk of it. I think a crucial piece would be to at least have it under some major lock and key. Because I have college-age boys who, it was a huge thing, they went to King Philip. And the number one way they were getting it is that someone went and stole it all from a store and then would sell it for like $10, $15 to the kids at the school, which is a lot cheaper than the $60 that you'd be paying in the store. So just as a footnote on that, if we're
Wow.
not looking at an overall ban, I mean, it needs to be kept away from, you know, anywhere that it can be accessed by a person, you know.
We're talking about essentially for commercial enterprises that we have in town today. It would
Right,
be a ban.
exactly. And I know that it was mentioned that it was being stolen from the Norfolk Food Mart. So I don't know what their theft rate is on it, but I do know that, you know.
It's kind of easy with all the liquor
Yeah.
bottles around.
Yeah.
It's easy to hide in there.
So, I mean, I'm sure things have changed. Like I say, my boys are in college now and maybe they are more secure about it because obviously it's a loss for them, but.
So getting back to the data, just for the record, from 2017 to 2018, in the United States, there was a 78% increase in e-cigarette and other electronic nicotine delivery systems. So that was a total of number of high school and middle school students. The number rose to 3.6 million in 2018 from up 1.5 million from 2017. I mean, 3.6 million. It's
We have basically an epidemic, and
Yeah.
the only way to really, I think, deal with it is first of all availability, and second of all education. You gotta get the word out to basically negate all the information that's out there, which is complete nonsense, and make it clear that these are not devices that are good for you.
It's on my radar for school committee to get it talked about with the health program, with the update the standards for elementary and figure out what's going on, because I know everything gets updated to catch up for the times. And I just, my last thing I'm going to say is, again, let's go for the gold standard. You have, even if you presented that tonight, doesn't it need to go through public review again, where other people would have a chance to?
Well, right now, we're going to
Negate
have
it
a
or-
hearing when we basically have this thing agreed upon among us.
Yeah,
But right now, this was an information gathering
Right.
activity to see
Right.
what response was.
okay.
It has been pretty one-sided, which I'm not surprised. So that just is who we are as a town, frankly. Anyway, I think we need to move on to our next topic. So thank you all for
What
coming
are the
by.
next steps, though, in regards to this topic? Does this mean that you take the information, you physically draft something?
We need to draft a new set of regulations.
Okay.
We have a draft actually in front of us.
Right.
What we need to do is pick out the parts we want to stay
Okay.
with. And if we need to modify anything, we have to do that.
Okay.
And then we end up with something which is complete
Yeah,
and ready to be basically published.
okay.
Then we ask for public
Hearing.
response to that.
And then it gets voted on and put into,
Then we vote on it
as a
at
board?
a gathering like this one,
Okay,
a
okay,
little later on this winter or spring.
okay, well, I look forward to reading that. Thank you.
All right,
Here's
thank you
my
all for
letter.
coming by, we
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you
you
for
for your
that,
help.
too.
Thank you.
Toxic waste.
Expecting Mr. McKinley. Oh, there he is.
Here.
Come on down.
Yes. Jen, I'll be right there.
This plenty of seats up front, guys, if you wanna, you know. So Rich, just turn it over to you so you can give an update on it. You know, sure.
Thanks so much, nice to meet you too. Good job.
So ladies and gentlemen, the second item on our agenda this evening is to discuss 17 Lawrence Street's public involvement plan and everything else that's swirling around that plan as we gather tonight. So we have our town planner with us, and so Richard McCarthy, would you please give us a little update?
Sure. Good evening, Board of Public. The last Board of Health meeting, I think it was in January, I believe, right? It was, I wasn't at the meeting, but some general questions came up about, where we are relative to the Buckley Man site at 17 Lawrence Street. And there's been a bunch of correspondence back and forth through emails and so forth, so coming in tonight, hopefully we can provide some information and then questions and Q&A and then see where everything else. So there actually has been, relatively speaking, as you know, if you don't know, the continuance was sent to the Board of Appeals today to continue the Abbeville comprehensive permit to the next available meeting. That the Board of Appeals will pick that up tomorrow night and to decide what when the next available hearing to be to discuss that. But there has been a few changes in between here relative to the contamination site and the LSPs, and one of the most present change is the fact that Steve Attieri with Mabit Associates, or engineering, actually, it's engineering, who was the LSP involved with doing the evaluation through Tom DePlacido, who is who's paying to have the evaluation done, has been directed by the Buckley Man family to hold off on doing any further evaluation and testing on the property in relation to the evaluation. The information that they have collected, which we'll talk about a little bit, hasn't been shared with myself or Paul McKinley from Weston Sampson or the board. They still have that information, the data and results, and that has been given to the Mann family, and they're looking through that as they have their own LSP. So as of right now, we haven't seen that data, it hasn't been shared with us, and we do not know who the LSP of record is for them as well. So I can't tell you anything as far as who that person may be or not be and where they're at. What we can at least share, at least a little bit, is so we did have some of the split sampling that was done when Navid was out there, so we have that data and we can, and I'll let Paul talk about that, as well as what does it mean in relation to where we're at with one LSP who is being hired by an individual who doesn't own the property, because the property is still owned by the Buckley Man family, and what that means going forward right now. So before I get too thin, I think it'd be easier just to hand it over to you to make my life easier, so I don't make any faux pas or mistakes and so forth. So
Sure. So again, Paul McKinley from Weston and Sampson. Hope my voice holds out. I'm getting over a horrible cold. So I thought it might be good. I know the Friends of Lawrence Street sent a list of questions. I don't know if that's a good place to start. Maybe run down those questions and go through that. So the first question, Mr. Viteri, is he required to submit those results to DEP? That question, it's really a process question with the regulations, the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. And there's a section in the MCP that talks about a person required to notify, and that's typically the site owner or a transporter. If a tanker truck flipped over, that would be the people, transporting. There's a list of folks that are required to notify the project applicant for this project really doesn't qualify as somebody who's coming in to do a purchase of the property, doesn't qualify as somebody required to notify. However, if those results are shared with the Buckley Mann family, those people are the owner of the property. They would be the responsible party. So once they obtain knowledge, they would have to notify under the timelines given in the MCP. And there's really 3 notification categories. There's the most pressing is an imminent hazard. It's a 2-hour notification requirement. So once the responsible party or the person required to notify has knowledge, and if it's an imminent hazard condition, they have to notify within 2 hours. And that would be notify Mass DEP. Next condition is a 72-hour notification requirement, a little less urgent, but still 3 days is a pretty quick time frame. And by far the most common is a 120-day notification threshold. So once they obtain those results, whichever category it falls into, they would have to meet those requirements. So from looking at the data, and again, as Rich had discussed, our role was to split samples with Mabit as they were collecting them. So if the phase 2 scope of work has well over 100 samples potentially proposed, so they had by far the most extensive sampling. The split samples are really intended to make sure that the samples were collected appropriately. So we had field staff go out and check and make sure their methods were appropriate. They were decontaminating their equipment, using proper methods for sample collection, proper bottle wear, chain of custody procedures, and really make sure that the data was representative. They talk about Parks parameters, is it precise and accurate, and is it good data? We need to, as LSPs, make decisions on the data, and that's really the foundation of what we work on. So it was a representative set of samples. It was 5 samples that we collected. We tried to give them a smattering over different locations, and as we get into the data a little bit, so jumping ahead to some of the other questions, we certainly did find some contaminants of note, of concern. But that was really the intent. It was a really limited amount of samples just to check really the QA/QC and the field procedures. So we obtained that data. It was, our data collection was January 18th and 25th is when we collected our samples. So assuming they got knowledge of these results somewhere along, or obtained those results somewhere along the same time frame, and then transmitted them to the Buckley Mann family, then the clock would start ticking once they have knowledge. So assuming that, let's say it's 120-day knowledge, they got it somewhere in January, that would mean 4 months out, sometime in May. Again, we collected our samples on January 18th, so assuming maybe that was the most conservative date of knowledge, that would mean 120 days, that would be May 19th, would be probably the earliest that notification requirement, if it was 120 days, would be triggered.
Paul, could you just clarify, what's the difference between, how do you determine a 2-hour, a 72-hour, and a 120-day notification? How bad do things have to be?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one of the hardest things we do as LSPs is actually determine these notifications. I think, anyhow, in my opinion, is one of the hardest things is to determine which category, and is it notifiable? This is actually some pretty intricate criteria on how you would determine that. And so in general, the 2-hour is sort of short-term acute health effects that could affect, sometimes it's indoor air, like people, inhalation. A lot of the criteria are superficial soils, so if you have a residential scenario and contaminants, oftentimes they're metals at high levels in superficial soil, they define that as the 0 to 1 foot interval, and it's within 500 feet of a residence, then that would constitute, and kids can have access to it, so if it's not a fenced property, again, not fenced, superficial soils within 500 feet of residence, if there's certain metals levels or certain hazards that contaminants could pose, that would trigger an imminent hazard scenario. So that's the 2. So a lot of times threats of release too. If you had a tanker truck flip over, that's more pressing. Releases to catch basins. There's a whole set of criteria. There's a whole page of these criteria. But generally releases that could be pose an imminent hazard to the environment or people would constitute a 2-hour notification threshold. 72-hour sort of leaking tanks, if you suspect an underground storage tank is leaking, those, some of those criteria, if you notice contaminants are migrating at a certain rate, that could affect like a public water supply, those are sort of 72-hour. And again, by far the most common are 120 day.
But the thing that triggers all of these options is whether it's above the mass contingency plan reportable concentration. Is that not, and is that in soil or in water or?
Yep, no, so in the 120 day, typically if you have an exceedance of the applicable reporting concentrations, and there are thresholds given in the Massachusetts contingency plan.
So
And
it's on this sheet.
And on this sheet, yep, so we have compared them to these RCS1, these reportable concentrations for
Yes.
soil 1, which is the most stringent category because there are, post residence, that's the project. So we compared to the most stringent criteria, and sure enough, there are some exceedances detected in just the limited amount of split samples that we collected, that if there were new contaminants, they would require reporting. So, and of course, the hot button one is PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls. Those are contaminants which weren't previously identified as a contaminant of concern. We found them in our samples. In a verbal conversation with Mr. Viteri, he indicated that he had sort of similar concentrations. We haven't gotten their data yet, but he indicated that they had them in their samples. He didn't say how many or what the concentration was, but he said generally the same ballpark. He detected concentrations and had them in his sample. So to follow through with that, yes, we would think that would, looking at the data and some of the criteria, it appears at first blush, from I'm looking at this limited data set, it's at least 120 day. It looks like it is a 120 day reportable scenario. So if I was the LSP working on this, looked like that May timeframe would be when the requirement would be to notify.
So the lead has been noted before.
Yeah.
Was that reported to, because the level was above the MCP level? So it's already been reported to?
So it's already been reported, so, the actions that are happening out there under a release tracking number, which was previously reported to DEP. This is, back, way back when it was reported. They did an investigation, they closed out the case. DEP audited it in 2007, said there was deficiencies in the closeout report. That's what triggered this next round of effort. So that's this phase 2 scope of work, is to fill the holes, per se, the gaps that DEP identified during their audit. So with these new contaminants, there is I guess this is jumping ahead to a question, once the responsible party has knowledge of these new contaminants, they would have to issue a release notification form, a revised release notification to DEP, and DEP can either issue a new release tracking number, a new case number, or just amend the existing release tracking number, the case ID, and again, the responsible party and their LSP would have to address it. And by address it, mean assess it, see if it poses a risk. If it poses a risk, have to, propose some sort of mitigation measures, whether that be, digging the dirt, encapsulating it, whatever that method may be, but they would have to address it through the MCP process.
But they knew it in 2007, and it never got addressed. It's still there in 2019.
The lead and
lead?
the other contaminants,
Yeah.
yep. No,
I'm totally.
So this is, take a step back, the process in Massachusetts, the way it works is a semi-privatized system where licensed site professionals oversee the cleanup, they submit opinions to the state. The state audited their closure report that was on the books with DEP in 2017, noted some deficiencies, and that's where Mabbitt was going back to the case and trying to address the deficiencies that were noted by DEP.
We'll turn open to the public as well, but I want to ask you something, Paul. There is a particular sample in the list of the splits that you all had. One from the Carbonizer Lagoon and one from the Carbonizer Trench. These were at a depth, is it zero, is it basically a surface sample?
Yeah, they are, from a superficial interval, 0 to 1 foot.
All right, so
And-
these are surface samples.
Yep.
And the news that really has a lot of people wondering what's going on, of course, we had these high concentrations of chromium and lead and occasionally some other things. And now all of a sudden PCBs show up. And it's interesting that it was only in the carbonizer lagoon and trench. And as you look at that, and in your role as an LSP, and having some knowledge of where do PCBs show up and why do they show up, and what does it mean when they show up? And obviously, we're well above the 1 ppm concern level, shall we say.
Yep.
What is your take on it in terms of concern and where it may have come from and all of that?
Yep. So just a little bit on what we analyzed for. In the phase 2 scope, we generally tried to mimic what Mabit was testing for. So we weren't trying to test for other parameters in the phase 2 scope of work. Really, they were analyzing specific samples for the contaminants of concern. So I think this is one of the questions is why we were analyzing it. Again, we're trying to check their data, not trying to collect our own data, really a spot check. And Mabit was collecting the vast amount of data on the site. We were just collecting a limited set to basically spot check their methods. But to the samples that we collected, sure enough, we found these PCBs. My understanding on talking to Mr. Viteri was that the PCBs that had been analyzed before and hadn't identified them above the regulatory thresholds. And these were really just a check to make sure that these weren't contaminants of concern as Mabit was proceeding forth in the new investigation phase. And sure enough, PCBs were detected at the maximum concentration was 25.2, another one in the carbonized lagoon. So one in the carbonized lagoon and one sample in the carbonized trench, sure enough had PCBs. So looking at this and reading about the carbonizer process, it certainly seems like the PCBs originated from the carbonizer process. It's if it came from the carbonizer, it was present in the trench and the lagoon, not in some of the other samples that were tested historically. So I'd be curious to see how many other PCB samples were run, and it seems like possibly down the road more PCB sampling would be required to try and determine the extent of the PCBs, and is it just limited to the carbonizer process, being the trench and lagoon? Those are all questions moving forward that I would think would need to be addressed given these couple results. Again, I think we just got the tip of the iceberg. Talking to Rich, I was equated to a puzzle. It's probably a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and we maybe have 5 or 10 pieces, and so it's really hard to see what the picture of the puzzle looks like at the end of it at this stage. But certainly, these results were concerning in that it wasn't a contaminant of concern identified previously. But again, to your question, it certainly looks to me like they're affiliated with the carbonizer process, and understanding that they use chemicals to treat materials, and maybe the PCBs were contained in those materials that they were treating, or maybe some of the byproducts, the waste that was generated as part of the carbonizer process. Understand they were stripping materials as part of that. So, how those PCBs originate is hard. I wasn't back there at the day, but certainly seems affiliated with the carbonizer process.
Yeah. And the fact that PCBs basically were banned quite a long time ago,
Yeah.
and they're still there. Kind of,
Yeah.
gives you a hint that these things stick around for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
That's quite a long time ago.
I think they were banned in '79.
Yep, 78, 79. And so just to talk a little bit more about PCBs in the process, PCBs typically fall under TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. And really the time frame of when they were released into the environment really dictates whether they're termed remediation waste or not. And there's certainly thresholds there. Long story short is looking at the age of the carbonizer process, it would be hard to determine that if they were deposited prior to 78, it looks like they could have been deposited after 78, which means the cleanup threshold and the regulatory criteria would be 1 part per million versus 50. So if the release happened prior to 78, sometimes the 50 parts per million threshold would come into play. If it's after 78, 79, a more stringent criteria of 1 part per million would seem to be applicable. Looking at these results and just, knowing a little bit of the history of the site, it'd be hard to determine if, it seemed like it might have occurred after 78, or it'd be hard to justify the burden of proof to demonstrate that it was prior to 78 versus after. So at first blush, it seems like that 1 part per million threshold would apply rather than the less stringent 50. And again, that's just my first blush at it, and it's, only a couple sampling points, but I tried to pose some of these questions to Mr. Viteri, and he was already under sort of, off the clock at that point for his client's instruction, so.
So why wasn't it ever detected before these 2 samples? With all the testing that's been done here since in the 90s?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, again, they hadn't identified it previously as a contaminant of concern.
But had they tested for it?
They had done some testing and just hadn't had detections that we came up with in a couple of locations. And again, I think it speaks a little bit to the process with the phase 2 scope of work is doing what it's intended to do, which is fill in the holes. And so by them looking at a more robust sampling program and analytical suite, it is identifying this contaminant of concern, which is a concern for sure.
Thanks. Any more questions, or shall we turn open? Folks have some questions for us, I guess you must.
Do you want me to keep going on the list? So I know I might have hit a few of them there, just going through, but let me go through. Time frame to submit results. Again, I think, my take on this is it's 120 days. By the way, more on that point, Mr. Viteri, if he thought it was an imminent hazard, he would have a requirement to report it as such within a 2-hour time frame. I did check the Mass DEP database a few days ago and hadn't seen anything new reported. So what I can glean from that is that his conclusion that it doesn't pose an imminent hazard either. So, and again, my take is that it looks like it's 120 days. So somewhere in that May time frame, May 19th would probably be one of the most conservative dates. And just to reiterate, the clock starts ticking when the responsible party, Buckley and Mann, has those results and has knowledge. The second question, will the phase 2 scope of work be followed and continue to split with the new LSP of record? I guess we don't know that. We don't even know, as Rich indicated, who that new LSP is. And just, I guess there's a couple options there. I guess the new LSP, I guess Mabit could continue on the project potentially, or the new LSP could continue down the same path that Mabit, basically continue the phase 2 scope of work that was implemented in one way, shape, or form, or I suppose they could, go another direction and maybe try and address the DEP deficiencies that was identified in the audit another way. But again, this is under a PIP process now, so they would have to, if they wanted to take a step back and start going down a different path, then the same process would need to be followed with public comments and discussion. So we talked about this a little bit, but it seems like those are the general avenues that this could continue on if a new LSP or the old LSP continues onwards. The third question, the time frame, what's allowed to the PIP petitioner's request. So I actually did a little homework to answer this question. I looked at both the Mass contingency plan, the regulations, and the PIP plan as written. And what I could glean from it was that the PIP process allows a comment period for major submittals. And it's interesting to note that actually there's a section in there that talks about changes in a phase 2 scope of work. So if the sampling process or the sampling program as proposed changed, I think that would be a trigger for the PIP group to re-comment on what that change in sampling plan would be. And again, I look at this as with the PCBs being detected, there very well may constitute a change in the sampling plan, such as expand the number of PCB samples and delineate the areas that was detected. Seems like that might be a change where the PIP process can re-engage and have participation in that process. And again, I looked at both the regulations, talk about it, and the PIP plan doesn't really specifically address it, but the regulations do talk about the major submittals, the report submittals, the phase, like when they do a phase 2 scope of work, and certainly there was plenty of comments there, and when the phase 2, when they get all the results and put it into a revised phase 2 comprehensive site assessment, this is the report taking all the data and looking at the risk, that they would submit a draft, and then we have opportunity to look at that and comment, so. And then the PCB levels and locations, I think I might have addressed question number 4 already.
So just to clarify for me, this PIP process, if the LSP that was working, Steve or Terry, Abbott, if they were the ones that put together the phase 2 plan, but they're no longer working for anybody, who's being paid? I don't understand, who's responsible now?
Yeah, right now it's the Buckley Mann family are the responsible party. They're the owners of the property. And maybe Rich can speak to more of the process. I think that Mabbitt was engaged by Tom.
That's right.
However, I see in the submittals that it looked like a representative of Buckley Mann was actually signing the submittals. Yeah, so, but it really defaults, to your question, the responsible party are the owners of the property. And so what I understand right now is the current status is that the Buckley Men have engaged their own LSP, and they're the ones who are potentially taking the lead moving forward. We don't know who that party is, but correct me if I'm wrong, Rich, but I.
No, we don't. So we don't know if theoretically Steve wouldn't be involved either. So, we don't know. He might continue to be involved or he might not be. So I can't.
The whole process doesn't start all over again, or anything? I mean, they'll use the data that they have.
Yeah, so that was sort of what I was laying out. I would hope that they would use the data, from what I understand, talking to Mr. Viteri, that he was, pretty well into the phase 2 process. So he's collected, some amount of data. How much we really don't know, but I understand it was he was into it. He was rolled up his sleeves and he was into the phase 2 scope of work. And that, I don't know, it sounded like that data might have been transmitted to the Buckley Mann family.
I think so.
Yeah.
At least that's the sense I got, but I don't have confirmation from that.
So it's just totally unknown whether the new LSP, again, will continue on the sort of pick up where Mabbitt Associates and Mr. Viteri left off, or maybe take a step back and look to implement a new sort of assessment process. Just don't know.
So, can I just reiterate my kind of understanding what happened here? Is there's about 100 sites, sampling sites that we're going to take samples from. You doubled up on 5 of those. In those 5%, you came up and you found PCBs. And 2 of them. Areas that people in this neighborhood had said, you really ought to focus in on this, in terms of the carbonizer. Pit in the trench, right off the bat. So then it seems as though the Mann family doesn't like what they've seen at this point. There's some data out there that we're not seeing because that person, Mabbitt, is associated with the contractor. The owner, Mann, are the people that are really controlling this. So this data potentially could disappear, all that sampling. There's no onus on anybody to present that data, either to this group or the town or the DEP apparently. And Mann could bring in their own LSP and they can come up with some other results. Is that my understanding? Is that a viable understanding?
Paul, didn't you say if there was really a problem that Mabbitt would have to, they wouldn't have seen the results, never mind.
There's a couple. Let me take a step back. There's a couple things. If it was an imminent hazard, there's the LSP board who actually dictates LSP's sort of conduct. In those regulations, it states that if there's an imminent hazard and an LSP is providing professional services, which means really stamping things, which is Steve has done. He's stamped a scope of work. That if you identify an imminent hazard, you notify your client, and if your client doesn't notify DEP, then LSP is required to in a certain time frame. And I looked at the DB's database, it doesn't look like anything was reported, so from that, it looks like, appears that their, Mabit Associates didn't determine that there was an imminent hazard. And then to follow on more in your statement, I can't speak to what's going on here, but if data was provided by the applicant to the project and Mabit Associates to the Mann family, who are the responsible party, then that would constitute what's called knowledge under the MCP, and then the clock would start ticking on their obligations to report. For instance, this PCB result certainly seems like a new reportable condition, so then they would have an obligation to fulfill, the reporting requirements. Again, it looks to me like 120 days, so, again, I think what we'd be looking for is somewhere in the May, maybe early June timeframe for a notification to occur. And if it didn't, I know the Friends of Lawrence Street have already sort of, put DEP on notice that these results are out there, and that's where sort of we could maybe prompt and say, hey, we know this data is out there, we certainly collected our own data, we know it's there, hey, where's the reporting, where's the notification to DEP?
If Buckley Mann doesn't meet that 120-day limit, or come and actually do that, is there any onus on Mabit to do that reporting in lieu of their doing it?
I think the onus really is only if there's an imminent hazard condition. That's my understanding as an LSP that only if there's an imminent hazard does Mabit Associates as a LSP have a professional obligation. However, again, once the data and Rich, correct, I thought the data might have been transmitted, I don't have confirmation of this, but if the data was transmitted to this responsible party, the Buckley and Mann family who own the site, then again, that would constitute an obligation for them to report if they believe it's a new reporting condition. So PCBs, my understanding, PCBs weren't detected, weren't a contaminant of concern, and weren't previously reported to DEP. So this would be something that would, in my view, constitute a clear new notification requirement. If it's 120 days, again, that puts it sort of end of May, somewhere in the June timeframe that they would be required to notify. And again, we split samples so the town, we have knowledge of these results as well. So if the responsible party isn't providing notification, we could certainly contact DEP. They've already, been contacted and say, hey, there's this, we're aware of this data, and hopefully they would follow up on it.
Yeah, so all I have is essentially an email saying that stuff was provided to the Mann family. It doesn't really say, there's no specificity in there, there's no, say, or I haven't, so it's hard because I can't really tell you unequivocally what's transpired. I can't say, this data, that, so it's somewhat we don't know, we really don't. If I knew, I would tell you, I don't know what transpired. So we're presuming that what they had, they provided to the Mann family, but to what extent and level, I don't know, to be 100% sure.
So we don't really even know if the Manns have been told and if they don't know, then they can't report.
You said you saw their, because they were signed on the chain of custody?
Well, that was for previous submittals, so again, that's, if they have knowledge of these conditions, then they would have an obligation to report, and as Rich is saying,
I guess I can't unequivocally answer you, say yes or, yeah, I mean, it's.
I'm just wondering if somebody held back up here and didn't inform them. Yeah. So if they don't have the information, they can't report it.
You mean stuff that we have, you mean?
No, something Mabit,
Oh.
they decided, well, let's hold off and not tell them that yet, or, let's do some more testing before we let them know the full scope.
I don't know. The devil's advocate to me about it would say that now granted, this is only if I was in this position, I would think that if I was looking to purchase a piece of property, and I became aware of some investigation, a lot more contamination, I think I would want to make sure I share that with the property owner before I mean, that's new, that would be new information, so it wouldn't be advantageous if I have results that, to not share them.
when you think about it, if the person who's thinking of buying the property has discovered there's a real significant problem with this property, would it make any sense to hide that from the owner? I would think it'd be just the opposite. What you probably want to do is point to the owner, hey, look, we thought we had some issues here, but now we've got something on top of all that. That could have some significant economic consequences. So I would be very surprised if, Tom Placido and his LSP weren't very forthcoming with the information that they've now got.
And just to add on to that, I mean, what I described before, the TSCA program is implemented by EPA, so it really is a second set of submittals and a second regulatory process that they would need to abide by going through it. So it would represent a significant sort of financial impact to the cleanup. So, that very well might be the impetus. So.
Is there any record of all of this contamination back 25 years ago, 30 years ago that the town's aware of? It has to be in the record somewhere, is it not?
No.
The PCB data we're seeing here, I haven't seen it before.
This
Yeah.
happened with the golf course. There was contamination.
Not PCBs, they didn't do
No, not
extensive enough
PCBs.
testing. The problem with the golf course was they didn't do significant testing, that's why the whole audit came back up and said that this.
Yeah, just to reiterate, so they did a fair amount of testing historically on this site. Again, DP audited the submittals that were on the books. The closure report said, hey, we think there's a couple holes here and there in your report. You need to retract the closure report, do more investigation to close these holes. That's what Mabit was in the process of doing, collected samples, and that's where these PCBs and the more comprehensive testing were identified. So again, looking at the historical reports, they hadn't identified PCBs previously. This is what I would, in my opinion, looks like a new reporting condition that would be required. That's, we're talking about the 120 days, end of May. So it is a little bit of a new condition that was identified. It's still sort of in the bucket of all the other contamination that's out there, the lead and the chromium, and we certainly know that there's some contamination still out there. So PCBs is another contaminant that was identified on the site, which would also need to be addressed. And again, this is where the PCBs are this TSCA program administrated by EPA Region 1. So when they go to do the cleanup and address this PCB remediation waste, it would have to be done under the TSCA program. And again, it's a separate program. It's a federal program versus the Mass DEP, Massachusetts Contingency Plan. So there is. As the applicant is probably looking at this, and as these results came up, it was bad news, and that it's a separate program, and now you got not a one-layer cake, it's a two-layer cake, and you have to do two reports to two regulatory agencies, and things can double up pretty quickly.
Just clarify for me one thing. So these folks are talking about 2007. That was long before Mabit and de Placido got involved. That was another project, right?
Right.
So there was testing done at that time, is that correct?
Yes.
But what they're asking, I think, is there were no PCBs at that time? Do we have records? Do we have any records from that time, from 2007?
They didn't test.
They did not test for it.
Limited testing.
So we don't,
That's a good point.
That's
We're not even
what
sure
you're-
they tested the carbonizer pit in the trench.
but somebody did some testing, whoever was gonna buy the property to build the golf course.
It was very limited and it did not.
Which is
I have a question. Right, so I have a question. So, thank you, Paul, for explaining all that.
Yes.
I see that, so at the bottom line, it says not tested for the other 3 locations for any PCBs. So we're not really sure if there were PCBs at the foundation or at the lagoons, is that correct?
True.
Can you test those samples yourself because you still have them?
We
Or it's too
could.
late?
Well, they're really outside of hold time, so even the results, and the labs oftentimes pitch the samples after 30 days. And a lot of times they stick them in the back fridge or out in the back lot or in the back drum so the results, while they'd be good to sort of screen potentially, at this late stage, I'm not even sure they would still have those samples. But to the process, I guess the process of addressing the PCBs, you know, as an LSP, typically what I would do is look at the process and say, okay, now it looks like maybe the carbonizer process might have been associated with these PCBs, and you would start with that information, those results that we have, and you would sort of work your way out and say, all right, if this is, you know, we call it a site conceptual model. Where are the contaminants? How are they released? How are they present in the environment? And then how do they get to receptors? You know, groundwater or the lagoon, or you know, a residence, or the town's drinking water well. You know, we start tracking it out from there and seeing if it poses a risk. So, you know, with these results, they very well might have to revise their phase 2 sampling plan to now address this contaminant. And maybe it's as simple as adding PCBs onto every sample that they're running and sort of screen the site, or do a more targeted approach, start in the carbonizer lagoon, see what the extent and the trench, and start with those processes and see if it's anomaly just on those 2 results. You know, it seems like, you know, we're 2 for 2 here. It doesn't seem like an anomaly. So, so if it is affiliated with that process, then you start tracking it out. And a lot of questions. You know, there was a liquid in the process, and there's solids. So is it in groundwater? Is it in soil? And really, you know, there's an iterative process that you would go to track the contaminants and the release and where it's now present in the environment, and how it would affect receptors, the environment, and people.
My understanding is that PCBs were typically used for electronic cooling. And the big transformers, for example, you see on power lines to your house, you know, up there, filled with oil for cooling. And during that period of time before the 70s, they started putting PCBs in there, and they were the largest source of contamination of PCBs. So if you have a factory that's using electric motors, things like that, and has transformers that they need to step up and down, all at once you're talking about the factory floor in that area, and they're having been exposed to PCBs, I would think.
So that's one source of PCBs for sure. PCBs, PCBs were a substance that had a lot of advantageous properties and were used in many different applications. Like, we're still dealing with PCBs, even though their manufacturer was stopped ages ago. We deal with them a lot in building materials and window caulking and you know, during building abatement. And so PCBs had a pretty wide ranging use, but a lot of times, and maybe in this process, you know, as they were stripping the PCBs from material, part of the carbonizer process, again, it just looks to me like the carbonizer process PCBs were affiliated with that one way, shape, or form. So whether, you know, workers were exposed because of electrical transformers in the building, or maybe it was a release from a transformer, or maybe it was part of the process when they were, you know, using the carbonizer process to strip the material, you know, a little unknown, and might be hard for us to unravel that story, you know, given that the process has been, you know, ceased for a couple decades. But what we can do is look at where the PCBs are in the environment and sort of track it out. So knowing where they came from certainly helps unravel the puzzle, if we could determine that at this stage, and maybe there's a way to do that. But ultimately, what an LSP would be looking for is what the concentrations are in the environment, where they are, how they affect receptors, and if there's a risk, how to clean them up.
Keep in mind, by the way, that PCBs are found, as you were saying, in lots of different places.
Yeah.
A lot of them were used for heat transfer and transformers, but among the many other uses for PCBs in the old days, dyes,
Oh,
Yeah,
no
that was a
idea.
wool.
Yep.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
pigments,
That's a great point. Yeah.
so they got around. So maybe it shouldn't be too big a surprise if they had that kind of process going on.
In the
They could end up
doghouse,
here.
sure.
So I had another question.
One second. No, go ahead, no.
Okay, so on your figure 1-2, where you labeled the carbonizer lagoon 19 and then carbonizer trench 8, can you look at it for a second?
Yep. 1, 2, got it.
Okay, so you see where you marked 8?
Yep.
So that's like a secondary trench. Did you mean to put it over there? Because this line here is the carbonizer trench. And that's like the unnamed trench?
I think it should be it's a little dislocated off of there. So what I will do, and I know there was an issue with the scale and the figures, and it looks like they did it, but ultimately what we'd love to do is get MAB's figures, because we were coupling up on their sampling locations, and I believe they surveyed their sampling locations, so once MAB, or if they transfer that data to the new proponent, they're the ones who are really ultimately gonna be using this data, so we'll provide them with the data, and they should be incorporating that into their risk assessment and their evaluation. So it's really not, I mean, our data would really, as I stated before, really verify their methods, rather than trying to generate a duplicative data set. I mean, it's just, it would be very cost prohibitive to try and collect our own samples, our own data set. We're just trying to check there. So we were trying to generate these in the absence of information from Mavic, who were really doing the sampling. Like, we didn't go out and survey the locations.
So you're not sure which?
No,
location it
we
was?
took photographs and documented it,
Okay.
and unfortunately, the sampler who was doing the sampling, was out, and so we were trying to fix these on locations from photographs. Again, we didn't survey the locations, so.
So then,
Sandy, your question was about station number 8, is that the one you're?
Right.
CTSS 8, yeah.
So it's really on the drawing located on the unnamed trench?
Yep.
Yeah,
Where
it's
this
sort
right
of north
here
of the
is
main
the-
trench.
What's that?
I say it's sort of north.
It's a
of-
little north, and it should be
Right.
on the main trench. You can
Right.
see the
If
line.
was-
It should
I
be
mean,
falling right there.
You should test over there too.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I was just wondering.
So, and to your question is, it really was taken in the main trench, is where the
Okay,
sampling
main
location was
trench,
taken.
all right. And so we had somebody who couldn't be here tonight ask if, they're using up until this week, I think, they're still using the site for the Lawrence Street Improvement Project. And somebody wanted to know if the dirt for the causeway should be tested, since they drove over the potentially contaminated foundations, to use the dirt for the roads project. So what's your opinion on the foundations? I know you have one sort of in that area, one of your test locations is in that area?
Yep.
Foundation number 3. But considering, they were also at foundation number 6, so, but at foundation number 3, I think you found something. Although this is pretty tiny.
I think, so we took a couple samples from foundation FND 3 and 6, and those are the 2 samples that we actually didn't identify any exceedances of reportable concentration, so there was no indication that there was contaminants over there at this point. But I don't know if you want to talk about the stockpiles.
Didn't you find some chromium? You did find some chromium there.
Yeah, sure, but not above reportable concentrations.
Right. But they were using that site, and you only took 2 locations,
Absolutely, we only split a couple samples, and we don't have all the other data. So, hopefully that might, again, back to the jigsaw puzzle, might fill in, and we might see a picture, and maybe that area, with, how many samples they collected there, and I think it's in the order of, 8 or 10, or they had proposed a fair number of samples over in the foundation area. With that results, then we could have maybe a greater level of comfort that it either is impacted or not, but we just don't know that at this stage.
Yeah, so to answer your question, I know there was discussion about the stockpile of material on the foundation. The initial thought, and I'm gonna maybe think about this, was to have them to remove the material off the foundations and not stockpile the material there any longer. As I'm sitting here, we might want to think about, that was going to be fill material on the road, and it might be worth looking at getting other fill material than reusing that. Having said that, there's a budget implication, so I need to kind of see whether it makes sense to take samples out of that fill material, or just leave it there, or remove it and test it.
Do you have an opinion?
I always have an opinion on these things. I mean, right now we have a couple sample results that show that there's not impacts over there. Without actually observing the operations and how it's stockpiled, oftentimes best management practices can be employed. So see how, what the path is they're taking, to get the material over there, and see if there's any potential impacts maybe in the pathway to transport the material. But if it is stockpiled on a concrete pad and there's no, and again, the concrete would act as a buffer. If there was impacted material underneath and the material was truly situated on a concrete pad, then it ought to have been cross-contaminated from impacts that are underneath. But if you test the pile, you might not ever determine whether it's from the Buckley and Mann site or from the point of origin, like that could be, fill from another location, sort of indigenous material that was originally used to construct. You may not ever unravel the mystery there. So, but just looking at the couple sampling results that we have, where there was no exceedances of reportable criteria, and by the way, if it's not exceeded, then it's likely not to pose a risk. So given the couple spot samples that we have, coupled with the fact that if the piles are stockpiled on a concrete barrier, that ought to prevent contamination underneath, then maybe there isn't as much of a concern for contamination from the Buckley Man site getting into that material. But again, it's very, very hard to say. I haven't been out there and observed there's sort of management practices of the pile. I didn't see how it was transported, and certainly we've talked about dust in previous meetings, and if they're traveling, it could kick up dust, and airborne particulates can get into. You could go on and on and on. But just sort of at face value, it doesn't look like the couple sample results that we have were impacted. And if a material was staged on a concrete platform, oftentimes that would limit the potential for cross contamination.
Yeah, so at the moment, the plan is to remove the material and stockpile elsewhere and get off the site. And then be not there anymore.
Do we know where the soil came from for the causeway?
The soil that's stockpiled there?
No, the soil
original?
from the causeway itself, was it?
The Buckley and Mann built that
Back
in
in
the
That Buckley and Mann built it,
the early teens.
because they built
No.
it, they got that soil from someplace.
1910s.
And, I'm sure they're not putting the best stuff there, right?
Yeah, I don't know what I can't answer that question,
So given that we have a bit of a surprise here, vis-a-vis the PCPs, why aren't we just going to the causeway and taking a few samples?
in the causeway itself?
Yeah.
And digging up and transporting off.
Well, I think,
We have an argument for why there might be PCBs in the Carbonizer Lagoon and Trench. What is the argument for there being in the causeway?
Well, the argument is that whole site we haven't tested. We don't know where the soil came from to the causeway. We can assume that's been amended over the years to make it larger than it initially was. And given that it may have PCBs in it and other things, it's upstream from everything else and it have an impact on everything downstream. And why do we assume that it's clean soil? Given that it's soil that has been moved by Buckley Man, we don't know where it came from in Buckley Man.
Not only where, but when. I mean, if the PCBs weren't invented back in 1900.
Yeah, they were. PCBs came out in 1890s.
Well, they weren't actually used in a commercial setting until the 1920s and 30s.
Okay, 1914, about that time into that. Monsanto took it, in the 30s?
Yeah.
And moved with it since then. But I didn't know they weren't used in dyes. I didn't know they were used in dyes.
Yeah, a lot of things. Depends upon which PCB you're talking about. Because there are a whole bunch of different ones. We only got one of them, actually. It's kind of interesting. We got one.
And not a common one either, so it's not.
Well, 1268, which is, 1254 is used a lot in different places. 1268 is, the last two digits have to do with how much chlorine is in there. So 68% is a lot of chlorine inside that molecule. So it's a pretty lipophilic, it's a fat soluble kind of
Yeah.
a material.
So, to speak to that, I did a little research back into the 2001 reports, and believe it or not, that they tested for PCBs, found very minimal PCBs, but then there's a little note down the bottom that indicated there was something similar to the Alicorp 1268. Did you see that note?
No, but keep going.
Right, so they didn't test for 1268, they tested for everything else, and let me just give you the quote. Let's see, it says, "This sample contains a halogenated organic substance similar to PCB, but it is not any of the target alipores." Is that how you say it?
Yep, Alcorn.
The sample suggests the unknown substance could possibly be Alicorp 1268. That's from 2001. And you know who gave them the samples? The Mann family. The Mann family picked the samples and sent them out. And they were from the carbonizer trench that the carbonizer had a space where they were, the wash tub basin was since filled in. It was from there. Carbonizer trench, carbonizer lagoon. It's on a drawing. I can show you the drawing later.
Yeah.
You can pull it up. So they never tested for 1268, but
And again, it sort of speaks to, that's the, you know, I mean, Mass DEP didn't specifically identify PCBs as deficiency, but, you know, Mavit in the phase 2 scope of work moving forward was doing sampling to fill in that gap and do the standard list. And so, by the way, when you do analyses these days, you have to meet requirements, and there's a standard analytical list. And if you're gonna deviate from those, and like, let's say you wanted to, these days, remove that specific Alicorp from your analysis, you would have to justify doing so, and certainly doing it would raise a lot of red flags. So, you really need to have a technical justification, like, you know, for instance, if you're limiting sampling just to lead or chromium, you need to know that all the other metals are absent before you do that. So, so I think the standard of care these days, it's advanced in the process as LSP's enacted, and it would just be a little more difficult to justify eliminating an analysis. And I have to go back and take a look, and I'm not familiar with the PCB analysis back in those days. Maybe 1268 wasn't in the standard parameter list. That could be a possibility. I just don't know. So.
right, so it would be a new contaminant.
Yeah. I mean, again, I looked at the previous table, and I didn't see any detections of PCBs in excess of the reportable concentrations. So, again, these detections appear to me, you know, at first blush and a couple of results, to be a new reportable concentration, required notification. From the information that I have, looks like it's 120 day, and again, you know, somewhere in the May or early June timeframe, notification would be required.
Just so I can understand the process, it seems to me you're saying that you got samples and you basically mirror all the tests that Mavit takes, right? Am I missing something?
Yes.
Yeah, no, we only, they were doing an extensive program. They had like 100 samples, maybe up to 140, depending on what they found. We were only splitting a select few samples on the town's budget. I mean, the town is paying for this, and those analyses, I'm just guessing, would be tens of thousands of dollars. We were just spot checking their field protocols and their laboratory. So we said, hey, which laboratory are you using? We picked another laboratory just to independently check the results. And this goes to sort of the sample collection methods, but also how they analyzed, and it's really to check the data, make sure that if, you know, we were getting a result, that result was repeatable. You know, this precision and accuracy. You know, are we getting the same result? Are we getting correct result? And it's really to QA/QC the data.
The few you did, you mirrored there.
And so we haven't gotten any of their results. But I did have a conversation with Mr. Viteri, and he actually called me and said, "Hey, you collected a couple samples. Did you get PCVs in your samples?" And I said, "Yes, I did." And what he indicated to me was their PCV results were generally in the same ballpark as the results that we got.
Way in the back, you have a question?
Can this board authorize additional split sampling with any future testing or ongoing testing by some other?
Authorize, like we have a budget? No, we can certainly
There's
request
some
it.
fee to pay them. Can you say use that for additional testing or additional split testing or be on site for all data collection by the other LSP?
Well, there's certainly going to be additional testing. We just haven't figured out yet who, when, and actually where. Because right now we're in a transition between one LSP and another. So we need to find out what the new sample grid even looks like. And for that matter, we still have a bunch of data we don't even have yet. These are samples that have already been taken.
Are they still testing or do we know or?
I believe it stopped. Is that correct?
That's what I believe it stopped, but
Can any
Were you
other
told?
LSP get in there by?
that it stopped.
Go do
As
it
far
there?
as, Mabit, there's no more, they haven't done, but that doesn't, I don't know that their own LSP. So just as far as the budget goes, we did have, so in the current contract, we had an allocation for $6,500 to do split sampling and to validate the method sampling. And because the way this has kind of weaved down the path, I've had to borrow against some other line items to be able to do some of the work that he's doing now, which is kind of shaped a little bit differently. We had originally put money in for, to do that down property,
Downgrading property.
downgrading property owner filing, but we haven't moved on that at the moment because of where we're at.
So
So,
do we need to request more money to keep up the testing plan?
well, we do, and
The warrant already closed for?
no, the warrant isn't closed. It's just a matter of trying to be diligent about. We want, not that we don't want to not spend money, but we want to be really mindful of how we go about putting the budget together. And we talked about this a little bit, like what is the best value for having Weston Sampson involved with this for working with the town to maximize dollars. And one of the we actually did talk a little bit about the idea of additional split sampling. But until we know what the next, where's this going, we haven't really identified whether, that makes sense or not. So, I mean, we have identified it, but whether it makes sense or not, we don't know yet. So, it's not to,
Is the new LSP beholden to the PIP process that we have in place with Mabit?
Yes. Yeah, it's a site, so it's a PIP site, not a PIP LSP. So it goes with the site, not the party. So that's the good news. That even if it switches again, if they choose to go with the phase 2 process that's unfolding now, then that's in motion. But if they go to change tax at all, again, they'll have to resubmit the draft report for public comment.
Way in the back, yes.
So it also looked like all the sites that were split sampled that we had data on were just all outside of the 500-foot notification radius.
Yeah.
Did they pick those sites or did you get to pick your specific sites?
So we were targeting locations, we were looking for for lack of a better term, some of the juicier ones, that were of interest. So we wanted to do some of the test pits and some of the carbonizer samples that we're doing were of particular interest to us. So we tried to target some of the areas of particular interest for us, and it seems like we chose wisely on a few of the samples.
But could there still be an imminent concern because they're just not tested within 500?
There absolutely can be, and again, they were doing a pretty extensive program, and it just so happened that those samples that we collected were outside from where we can measure, outside of a 500-foot radius from residentially zoned properties. And again, that doesn't mean that, and this is something that we would be looking out for, that the samples ought not to be limited to, collecting them from 1 foot or below to avoid an imminent hazard, or just outside the 500-foot radius. They should be sampling and tracking the contaminants wherever it may lay. So that's and sort of to your question, to our efforts. Rather than splitting sample, those are the kind of things that, as I'm looking at the sampling plan, sort of picking up on that, to making sure they're analyzing for the right contaminants and the right spot. And they really should be evaluating the risk, and that includes these imminent hazard conditions, and so, and again, as I described earlier, the imminent hazard conditions come if there are routes for exposure, and this is where if you've got trespassers or kids walking across that site, if there are contaminants such as, high concentrations of metals in the 0 to 1 foot interval, and trespassers or kids or people who are out there being exposed to it, those are the sort of risk scenario or exposure scenarios that need to be evaluated as part of this revised phase 2.
Yes, ma'am. Oh, wait, one more thing. I've been not doing this faithfully. Would you please say who you are?
Peggy Barrett. So, just curious, you came up with this PCB. How do we know that we've kind of covered anything, that there'd be no more surprises, no more other chemicals that sort of present themselves? How would we know that that was the case? Is it just sort of, it could be, but we'll never find them? Is that a possibility?
There's always some uncertainty in this process, and this goes to the classic balance between how much money and how many samples do you collect versus certainty, and there's always a cost benefit and a balance. And depending on who you talk to, so where that risk and that balance comes to, we all have our sort of different perspectives and view on these things. So,
why did you go to PCBs? I guess that's how did that even come into play?
Yeah, I mean, again, the PCBs, they were looking at this. I guess the parties involved weren't satisfied that PCBs were properly assessed for, and that's why some of the samples were targeted for PCB analysis. So they actually, the previous results didn't detect any PCBs, yet they were doing some confirmatory samples to rule that contaminant out as being not something to be concerned of on the site. And sure enough, it turns out, much to a surprise, that PCBs were present. So to your question, how do you chase this down now and assess it? And I think I talked to this before. You sort of look at, why do you think you come up with what's called a site conceptual model? Why do we think the PCBs are there? Again, it looks maybe like it's affiliated with the carbonizer, process, but if they only did samples in the carbonizer process, how do you know it's not affiliated with other processes? So, again, this is as we move forward and this unfolds, and again, as I said earlier, I would expect that they would tweak their sampling plan to now address PCBs and investigate them and try and chase them. So, the typical process is you identify the contaminants, how they were, you come up with a theory, and then you come up with a sampling plan to prove or disprove that theory. So, if the theory is it started in the carbonizer process, you start there and maybe radiate outwards. And there very well always may be some level of uncertainty, but that's, that as it folds out and it is a PIP site, we'll all get to look at the data and sort of decide for ourselves whether we think they've done an adequate job, and do we think that they've, got their arms around it, and we all have a warm and fuzzy feeling that we know where these contaminants are, and again, everybody has their own sort of level of care and perspective on these things, but I suspect there's going to be probably a long process in front of us, and we'll all get an opportunity to comment.
Can I ask you, and I'm gonna try to tie them in so I'm not hogging time, but did you check the dry wells leading from the foundations? Just so I don't, are there other chemicals that might be tied to these PCBs that would be something you should look at sort of relevant? I'm not sure that the materials were stored on top of the concrete. I believe they may have been initially on some of the ground in front. That's what, when I walked there, that's what I saw. I walked down the street and I didn't see them on the concrete, I saw them actually on the soil. And I have one more question, but I don't remember what it is, and I apologize. I'll probably ask it at the end of your answer.
I think he sampled where Peg is talking about, isn't he?
It would dry wells.
Yeah, no, I believe, maybe Sandy knows this as well, but I believe that the phase 2 does address those dry wells, and so they're, you know, they are collecting samples. I'll have to go back and double check. It's been a.
So you just don't have them?
No.
And then the other thing I wanted to say, and I forgot about this, was motility. It seems like PCBs have high motility, so isn't that concerning in that regard as well, or did I just misunderstand when I read?
And by motility you mean?
It sounds like they migrate quite substantially, that they're
Yeah, so PCBs are typically more of a solid contaminant, and in my experience, the sort of groundwater migration is not typically what you see with PCBs. It's more rare to see sort of a groundwater PCB issue, not out of the realm of possibility, but typically it's more of a solid phase type contaminant, and usually. And when I speak with generalities, sometimes you get in trouble. And but you know, I guess you know industry wide, I think it's usually more of a solid rather than a groundwater issue. Is PCBs? I don't know if that answers your question.
So they move, but they attach to something. That's. I mean, I really thought I read that they had some.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly some contaminants like you know chlorinated volatile organic compounds in groundwater, or sometimes in the news you'll hear about these PFAS and PFOAs and emerging contaminant. A lot of those are very mobile and persistent in the environment and can travel in groundwater great distances. That's typically not what you see in PCBs. Doesn't mean it can't happen in this instance, and it's not present. That's again something that will need to be assessed and evaluated and proven. But with these contaminants, typically they're not. As mobile as some other contaminants that we oftentimes deal with. So
to reinforce what Paul just said, this particular PCB with the large 68 at the end of it means it's heavy. It's got a lot of chlorine in there, which means it loves to stick around with basically organic stuff and not with water. So it's not that soluble, very, very insoluble. Which means it's got less mobility than you might think. However, back in the day when I worked at the aquarium, we were looking at situations where we had worms feeding on organic rich sediment and soil, and then the worms became the food for another critter, and then another critter ate that one, so on up the food chain, and that's where you can get mobilization, but it's kind of biologically mediated, rather than happening by some inorganic kind of process like water washing through. So it's complicated. There are ways for these things to migrate through the environment that you know, they're hard to model.
yeah. Let me answer your question another way. I would think that we've just got a couple initial sampling results and we really don't know what the nature and extent of the contamination is yet. So I think that is what we as a group should be looking for, is to make sure that nature and extent of contamination is fully known, and that's really the regulatory requirement as they go through this phase 2 process. They really need to determine the full nature and extent of the contamination, and then do a risk assessment to see how if those contaminants would pose a risk again to receptors, environment, and people. So we just don't know yet like what the extent is. I think.
There aren't other chemicals to concern ourselves with that kind of were utilized with that chemical. That's
Like tracer chemicals or
I don't know, I just
coke,
wouldn't-
and you know.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that sort of ties back to the processes, right? So you know, in the you know operations that happened at the site, if there were other contaminants. Like you know, if like in the carbonizer process, if you've got hexavalent chromium associated with that, and you found you know hexavalent chromium somewhere maybe outside the carbonizer, again that would be you know an indicator potentially for me as an LSP to say, hey, maybe I ought to be analyzing for this for PCBs as well. If those are you know like contaminant streams and they were affiliated with each other, sort of lines of evidence that we would use to help sort of track these things down. A lot of times you don't know what the picture is. You sort of you know this site conceptual model. You make a theory and you try and do design a sampling plan to prove or disprove and modify as necessary.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm probably Margaret Haley.
Thank you.
Just probably more a couple of comments. I just I think like the rock and the hard place that we're in between right now, we all just need to be very patient because with the PIP process even, they have 2 years to come to an end result with the phase 2 scope of work. So, you know, not getting these results or anything at this point and not knowing what's going on is very frustrating, but I also am so grateful that we have our LSP working for the town, and I would actually hate to see the money wasted on double testing. I know a lot of people have asked for that, but I think it's really not necessary. What we need to do is get the test results that have already been done. The idea of the town doing any testing was just to mirror theirs and make sure their testing was on track, and keeping you around is gonna make sure that, okay, well, if we found it here, then we need to head south or we need to head west to look for more, and you're gonna be able to make sure that those things are taken care of. So just, that was really all I wanted to say.
Thank you. Anybody else who hasn't had a chance or is up for another review? Sandy, go for it.
I do have one more question, or a couple. So one, does this mean this could be a tier 1 site? And number 2 is, so does that mean no homes can be built within 500 feet of where there are PCBs above 1?
It's a good question. You can build, just so long as they're in a risk. So there's policies about building on contaminated sites, and you obviously don't want to pose a risk or an imminent hazard by building a structure. So they would certainly have to get a full understanding of the site, do a targeted risk assessment, and make sure that there is no risk posed by their proposed future use. And the regulations actually talk about that process. You need to do a risk assessment, look at, 5 years out, or if you know that there's a development on the books, such as, Abbeville, then you would need to evaluate those risk profiles to ensure that there isn't a risk. So,
We
again,
don't even have the risk assessment yet.
so it's again, it's a little hard to answer those questions, and that's where in the ZBA process they said, hey, you need to, before you can move ahead with the construction, they had said, get that phase 2 in, which includes those risk assessment, and then you could proceed forward. And that was one of the conditions that was put in the ZBA process, and I think wisely so, because at that stage they would have an understanding of the site and be able to determine if there was a risk.
So does this raise it to a tier 1?
So there are some inclusionary criteria that kick a site to a tier 1 site, and knowing the 2 criteria, this doesn't kick it in. I think there's imminent hazard is one, and I think impacting groundwater well is another one at this stage. So off the top of my head, it's a good question. I don't think that would trigger to a tier 1.
Other questions? If we have used up our questions, thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah, no problem.
As always, for all of your information and advice. Thank you. And we obviously need to watch how the things roll out in the next few days, particularly the issue of the testing that's already been done and finding the best way to get our hands on that data so we can find out whether there are any more surprises.
So just to summarize, we do have money already, as we're going through the budget process. We know we have money in our department budget that we have available to kind of see what happens as far as the year unfolds. And this past year, we used that money, about 80% of it, 90% of it for this. And then going forward for the next budget year, we've already allocated, reserved it for this process as well. The question is whether, we need to do some supplementing of it. So we'll have to have a little bit more discussions about that, but the timing is a little where we might be able to take what we have already and then what we already allocated and kind of assess where we're at and then do something in November potentially, but we're trying to figure that out right now. So I just want to let folks know about that. And I think
We'll see. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Long day,
My
man.
voice was faltering right at the end there, I made it, I think.
You made it, you made it.
That's good. Good, hanging in there.
I tell you, you did a really good job with the rowdy crowd.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, you guys weren't, you know.
Is Rowdy number one talking here?
That's a tough crowd.
Great,
You did
great
a-
questions.
You did a great job.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
All right. So what time is it now? So, next on the agenda, minutes.
Minutes, I motion that we accept the minutes of the January 22nd, 2019 meeting, Board of Health meeting.
I second that motion. Further discussion, I hear none. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Correspondence.
Correspondence, so I just would like, the thing that I jammed in the paper copy. Each year we get a review, monitoring of the landfill. And in 2017, this is 2017, it was noted that dioxin was detected in 3 wells that they tested. And I mentioned it at the time, and I asked one of our members to look into it. It never got looked into, but so now we're into 2018, and in the 2018 report, once again, they're talking about dioxin. So I sent an email today to Bob McGee and just asked him if he could explain it to me.
It says it's above, it doesn't say what it is.
Well, no, okay, so let's go to the actual chart. So there's the chart. So that's,
So, these are the data.
and this is what I get confused about. Does that say mass contingency? And then it goes in a different direction, and you know.
MCL, maximum concentration.
Okay, where did I, no, here. No, that's MCP, Mass Contingency Plan.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, if you want to look at the actual document in this book, so that you'll see that those 2 little asterisks mean Mass Contingency Plan.
Yeah, okay.
I don't understand if it's above the mass contingency plan. This is why I was asking Paul about when do you have to report, because according to this, it says that you don't have to notify DEP. So this is the 2017 report, and there were 3 wells. This is consistent with previous samplings and does not require notification. Maybe they notified Mass DEP at one point, and that's why they don't have to
Well,
notify them again,
If they're
which is,
picking it up every year.
if they're picking it up every year.
It's a
So,
recurring problem.
okay, so it is a recurring problem, and in 2018, fortunately, the good news
Is it lower?
is they only detected it in GD3, this one,
Yeah.
and it's 0.38 instead of 0.39, so for some reason it's not in
And
the
these are no
others.
longer there.
Well, what number is that?
G38,
Uh,
or 3S.
It's an S. Yeah, so it says none detected. G3S, none
Yeah.
detected, and what's the other one?
MW3.
MW3, and that says undetected. So I guess that's good news, but it's interesting, how did it change? Or does it dissipate? What happens to it?
Or why is it even there in the first
Yeah,
place?
well, apparently it's from paint. Is that dioxin is a breakdown product from, I think, what I read years ago, last year, which I don't remember this year. I think it's from organic solvents and paints. Well, I just wanted to mention that I did send this to Bob McGee, asked him if he can tell me why it's not reportable, and maybe he'll say because it's already been reportable. And then, is there anything we're doing about it? Should we be doing something about it? Because how can we be ensured that it's not getting into the groundwater?
Well, if they're in wells, and these are wells that are downstream of the dump. So these are heading basically,
These are at the dump, aren't they? I think
well,
those.
yeah, but I'm saying the water, if it's moving through the dump,
Uh-huh.
is heading essentially, I think, kind of south and west, like along, you know, where the Medway branch is, heading toward Millis essentially,
Okay,
eventually the Charles River, so.
everybody's got wells in town, and there's a lot of homes
Yeah.
in that area. I don't know, I just wanted to, 2 years in a row, find out what the answer is. Maybe you guys had already addressed it years ago, I don't know.
No, I think we did. We do a priority pollutant scan for doing like a new well in a house. I need to take a look at one of those long lists of things we check for to see if 1,4-dioxane is on there. 'Cause that's, I don't know that it is actually.
I can send you
Yeah,
one
like
to
just
you?
a recent one?
Yeah.
That'd be good to have. Because maybe actually it is. Because these are VOCs of a general sort. It's right there with, you know, diethyl ether and chloroform and acetone.
Okay,
What is the water supply for the river's edge? Is that town water?
Yeah.
well, I didn't see anything in the Gold Street well, because we get a report of that. I don't recall dioxane in that. Well, I don't recall it on any of, I mean, we get a report,
Right.
all of us, the citizens, but I'm not sure they actually mention dioxane. They do, they say if you want
Right.
to see any other
Right.
things, but I think they would have to say something if they saw a level that was high. Anyway,
So is there any building going on down there that requires wells?
we're putting in a new well on Holbrook Street. Is that? So they must have tested.
Yeah, it would have had to.
Other building? Not in that direction, before the bees.
Holbrook Street, is that a town water? There's more of the town that's been plumbed in. We have fewer wells being done.
Well, it's still a lot of people that, the original. I mean, these are the new developments.
Well, if you just check and see if we have any recent results. Thanks.
Okay.
All right, what else we
Okay.
got?
No, that was all for correspondence. I just wanted to
Okay,
handle that issue. And what's next?
RC, you're on, I think.
RC, volunteer. Oh, Stop the Bleed went well. 26 people showed up. It was really well attended. Got a couple of new members that showed up at last night's meeting.
Oh, good.
Yeah, and so now the MRC is going to have a table at the volunteer fair. And so that should be good. And also, we scheduled a pet first aid for May, I have to look at the minutes, May 4th or 5th, I don't know, which will happen at the library. And Dr. Eileen Siegel is going to present that. And yeah, so we have a lot going on. People are enthusiastic. We have about 10 people that 10 people that come and go, different ones, different meetings. But, so I think we have about 20 people actually that are engaged. And Betsy and I continue to work on the EDS plan. And making headway on,
Great.
on it, and we're waiting to hear from the federal, public health emergency planner, Garrett Simonson, I forget his last name, who's gonna come and help us a little bit more, walk us through,
Yep.
do a drill, so, yeah, things are moving along.
Thank you very much, Fran, for energizing this whole operation.
Well, I'm telling you, it's all about the people, you know?
Well, we got some good news.
It's about the people. And, yeah, that's it.
Okay.
Oh.
Second annual volunteer fair, we got that covered. New business of any sort?
Well, you know, the only thing I'm wondering is how do we go forward with these tobacco regs? Because there are a lot of changes. And if we don't discuss them one by one, which I don't want to do tonight because I'm exhausted and I'm sure you are, but,
Well, there gotta be 3 of us here too.
well, exactly, so, I mean, but.
Jeff called him, I think.
No, I just checked my email too.
Yeah, the one night. I mean, how would you go, what can you see happening as to
Well,
go
I mean,
forward with?
I think, you know,
Anything
so
that's yellow.
the few pages that really we need to focus on are the ones that are changed. I mean, the whereas is
Right.
most, I mean, okay, yeah, it's data,
Yeah.
fine. That's data, fine.
Yeah,
Let's get to the part where we're actually doing something different in terms of regulation. And so that happens after the definitions.
well, then we have to get into the definitions, which is a lot. All of that yellow is,
Well, right.
that's,
This page.
that's a lot. Well, even the other pages, definitions.
Oh,
Anything
no,
that's yellow. No, you're still
No,
on
it
the
starts-
whereas.
well, it starts
Okay.
here.
Yeah,
So this page you gotta work on. So page 4,
through,
page 5, you have a lot of stuff to do.
right.
But the definition shouldn't take us very long, they're pretty self-explanatory. Which is all this, page 6. We only have stuff we already have. And then we get into the thou shalts, which are page 8, page 9. So once you get through the definitions, it's really these couple of pages right here. Focus on.
Which include increased fees, adding cigars, and, I mean, a lot of stuff. So how, what would your suggestion be to go through it? And because if we have, you know, at an open meeting, can we just go through them one at a time, one paragraph at a time and say, check it off, and
Yeah, you can. I mean, just do the homework ahead of time so you know what you're
Right.
gonna be asking questions about, but otherwise, that's exactly what we gotta do.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've seen this before, you sent this to us.
There was another piece from Sarah that explained the process.
Yeah, there was like a cover
Right.
sheet.
Right,
Yes.
I think
No.
I attached it, yeah.
Oh, maybe you didn't get the email.
You mean this or something different?
No. So, because it was only to me. But I think we need, I'll have
Is
to.
it a public hearing process, is that?
No, she said, I've attached the draft, there are some very minor changes in semantics, but there are new whereases, and then there are, she explains the greens and the yellows, which is something that you folks need to have as you're reviewing this, okay? I'll just forward it to Betsy.
Okay.
Am I CC'd on
I
that?
don't know why you weren't CC'd on this. It was to me and to Mary Cole. I don't know. That was interesting. That was on February 1st. So, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I've attached the draft for your consideration. So,
All right, send
you
it
need to
around.
see this,
Yeah.
okay, because that explains the changes, okay?
Okay.
And we can take as much or as little.
Mhm.
But people are hoping we'll take more
Well,
than
they
less.
want us to take it all.
We'll take more than less, okay. Okay.
Yep. All right, is there a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion that we adjourn the
All right, I
March,
second, all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
We'd be done.